Open your eyes wide, we're going to explore the hidden riches of Africa. Not the diamonds and gold we imagine, but a much more precious wealth, the history of exchanges, trade routes, and the unity of African peoples. Imagine a great road, thousands of kilometers long, crossing burning sand deserts and steep mountains. On this road, camel caravans carried bags of gold, blocks of salt, precious fabrics, and spices. This was the Trans-Saharan trade route, a highway of wealth that connected West Africa to northern countries like Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Africa was not a poor and isolated continent. On the contrary, it was at the heart of a vast network of economic exchanges. African empires, such as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, were famous for their gold. The king of Mali, Mansa Musa, was so rich that during his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he distributed so much gold along his way that he caused the price of this precious metal to drop in Egypt for several years. This is a true story, told in history books. But this wealth came not only from gold. Africa was also a major producer of salt, cola nuts, ivory, and unfortunately, slaves. Trade was the key to power. Cities like Timbuktu, Jen, and Gao were commercial and intellectual centers. Merchants there exchanged books, ideas, and goods. Pan-Africanism is the idea that all peoples of Africa and people of African descent around the world should be united. This unity was born from the awareness of this shared history, these economic exchanges, and the struggle against slavery and colonization. The word Pan-Africanism comes from the Greek pana meaning all and Africa. It is the idea that Africa and its descendants form one big family. This course will show you how economy, trade, and wealth have shaped Africa's history and how this history led to the idea of African unity. SEP First Part, The Trade Routes of Ancient Africa. Africa was not always a poor continent. Before the arrival of Europeans, there were powerful empires and very active trade routes. The most important trade was that of gold and salt. Gold came from the mines of West Africa, in the region of Ghana and Mali. Salt came from the Sahara Desert, especially from the salt mines of Tagaza. Why was salt so important? Because without salt, you cannot preserve meat, and the human body needs it to live. In hot regions, salt is essential. Berber and Arab traders crossed the desert with camel caravans. A camel can carry up to 200 kilograms of goods and walk for days without drinking. These caravans could number hundreds, even thousands of camels. Imagine the sound of bells, the cries of the camel drivers, and the dust raised by thousands of feet. It was an incredible sight. The goods traded were not only gold and salt.
All over the Muslim world to study there. Books were very expensive because they were handwritten. A library could be worth a fortune. The economy of these empires was based on trade. Kings levied taxes on goods crossing their territory. Thus, they became very rich. For example, the Ghana Empire, which existed from the 8th to the 13th century, was called the Land of Gold. Its kings were so powerful they could raise an army of 200,000 soldiers. The Mali Empire, in the 14th century, was even larger. Its king, Mansa Musa, is considered the richest man of all time. When he went to Mecca, he spent so much gold that his passage caused the price of gold in Egypt to drop for over 10 years. This is an example of Africa's economic power. These trade routes connected not only West Africa to the north. There were also routes to the east, towards the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. The ports of East Africa, such as Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar, traded with Arabia, India, and China. Chinese coins and Indian pottery have been found in these ports. This shows that Africa was connected to the whole world. Trade was therefore a factor of unity. Different ethnicities and cultures mixed on these routes. Languages spread, like Swahili, which is a mix of Bantu and Arabic. Religions also spread, like Islam. This history of trade and exchanges is an important foundation of Pan-Africanism. SEP's second part, the slave trade and the destruction of Africa's economy. Unfortunately, this wealth and trade attracted greed. From the 15th century onwards, Europeans began to arrive on the African coasts. At first, they sought gold and spices. But very quickly, they discovered an even more lucrative trade, that of slaves. The slave trade was a catastrophe for Africa. For over 400 years, millions of Africans were captured, sold, and forcibly transported to the Americas. Historical documents, like the account 12 Years a Slave, tell this terrible story. Men, women, and children were torn from their families, crammed into ships, and sold as objects. This trade destroyed Africa's economy. Wars between African kingdoms multiplied, as chiefs sold their prisoners to Europeans. Entire villages were depopulated. Traditional trade routes were disrupted. Africa lost a large part of its working population, those who worked in the fields, mines, and workshops. Africa's economy collapsed. Meanwhile, Europe and the Americas grew rich through the forced labor of slaves. Cotton, sugar, and tobacco plantations in the Americas produced immense wealth. European ports, like Liverpool, Nantes, and Bordeaux, became rich from this trade. This is called the triangular trade.
And South America have kept the memory of this suffering. But they have also kept cultural ties with Africa: music, dance, religion, cuisine. For example, blues, jazz, and gospel were born from the mix of African traditions and plantation life. It is this shared history of suffering and resistance that gave birth to Pan-Africanism. Thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois, an African American, and Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican, began to say, "We, black people, are one people, scattered around the world. We must unite to regain our power and dignity." Pan-Africanism is therefore a response to the slave trade and colonization. It is the idea that Africans and their descendants must come together to rebuild their economy and culture. SCP Third Part, Colonization and the Exploitation of Resources. After the slave trade came colonization. At the end of the 19th century, European countries, France, England, Belgium, Portugal, Germany, Italy, divided Africa among themselves. At the Berlin Conference in 1884 they drew borders without regard for peoples and cultures. Africa was divided into colonies. The colonizers took control of natural resources: gold, diamonds, copper, rubber, oil, cocoa, coffee. Africans were forced to work in mines and plantations for very low wages, or even without pay. Africa's economy was organized to serve Europe's interests. The colonies had to produce cheap raw materials and sell them to European industries. Factories were in Europe, not in Africa. For example, the Belgian Congo, under King Leopold II, was the scene of horrible crimes. Congolese were forced to harvest rubber, and if they did not produce enough, their hands were cut off. Millions of people died. This is a tragedy documented in history books. Colonization also destroyed traditional economic systems. African artisans, blacksmiths, weavers, potters could no longer compete with industrial products imported from Europe. African trade routes were replaced by railways built to transport minerals to the ports. Africa became a supplier of raw materials, not a producer of manufactured goods. This situation continued after independence in the 1960s. African countries, although independent, remained economically dependent on Europe and the United States. This is called neocolonialism. Economic Pan-Africanism proposes to change this. The idea is that African countries must unite to create a common market, build factories, trade among themselves, and no longer depend on former colonizers. For example, the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, created in 2021, is a Pan-African project. It aims to remove customs barriers between African countries so that goods, services, and people can move freely. To
promote unity, peace, and development. One of the major economic projects is the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA. Imagine a large market of 1.4 billion people, with a total wealth of over $3,400 billion. This is the potential of a united Africa. If African countries trade among themselves, they will create jobs, factories, and services. For example, a farmer in Senegal could sell his rice to Nigeria without paying taxes. A clothing manufacturer in Kenya could export his shirts to South Africa. This would help develop local industry. Another example is the African Development Bank, AFDB, which finances infrastructure projects, roads, dams, power plants, ports. These projects connect African countries to each other. There is also the Great Green Wall project to combat desertification in the Sahel. Economic Pan-Africanism also includes a single currency. Several West African countries already use the CFA franc, a currency linked to the euro. But some want to create a common African currency, the ECO, to strengthen economic independence. However, this project is still under discussion. Pan-Africanism is also culture. African artists, such as musicians, writers, and filmmakers, work together to promote a modern African culture. For example, the Panaf Festival in Algiers or FESPACO in Ouagadougou, African Film Festival Pan-African events. Pan-Africanism is the idea that Africa must rely on its own strengths. This is the message of Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, who said, "Africa must unite or perish." He meant that small, isolated African countries are weak. But together, they are strong. This is the lesson of history: division weakens, unity strengthens. For CE2 children, understanding Pan-Africanism means understanding that Africa is a rich continent with a glorious history, and its future depends on the unity of its peoples. SEP Deepening section, going further in understanding the Pan-African economy. For young students who want to know more, let's explore some key ideas. First, the concept of economic dependence. During colonization, African countries were forced to export raw materials, cocoa, coffee, cotton, oil and import manufactured goods, cars, machines, medicines. This model persists today. For example, Côte d'Ivoire produces 40% of the world's cocoa, but it does not make chocolate. Chocolate is made in Europe and the United States, and the chocolatier earns much more money than the cocoa producer. Economic Pan-Africanism aims to break this cycle. How? By building processing factories in Africa. For example, Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire have built cocoa grinding factories to produce cocoa butter and cocoa powder, which are worth more than raw beans. Next, there is intra-African trade.
Differences in languages and currencies. The AFCFTA aims to reduce these barriers. For example, if a company in Kenya wants to sell shoes to Nigeria, it must pay high customs duties. With the AFCFTA, these duties will be gradually removed. This will encourage African companies to produce more and create jobs. Another important point is currency. Currently, 14 West and Central African countries use the CFA franc, which is guaranteed by the French Treasury. Some say this limits the economic sovereignty of these countries. The ECO project, a single currency for all of West Africa, is under discussion. But there are challenges. Countries need to have stable economies and good governance. Finally, economic Pan-Africanism also includes agriculture. Africa has 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. If African countries invest in agriculture, they could feed the world and create millions of jobs. For example, the Great Green Wall program in the Sahel aims to plant a strip of trees 8,000 kilometers long to combat desertification and improve soils. This is a Pan-African project. In conclusion, economic Pan-Africanism is an ambitious but necessary project. It is based on the history of ancient Africa's trade exchanges, the struggle against colonial exploitation, and the vision of a united, prosperous, and independent Africa. SEP methods and tips for understanding and remembering. To remember the lessons on economic Pan-Africanism well, here are some tips. Make mind maps. Draw a map of Africa and trace the ancient trade routes: gold, salt, ivory. Color the empires: Ghana, Mali, Songhai. Add the traded goods. Use key figures. Remember that Mansa Musa was the richest man in history, that the AFCFTA concerns 1.4 billion people, that intra-African trade is only 15. Play a role-playing game. Imagine you are a merchant in Timbuktu in the 14th century. What do you sell? To whom? How do you travel? Make connections with current events. Watch news about the African Union, the AFCFTA, or African products: cocoa, coffee, oil. Talk about it with your parents. Tell the story. Pan-Africanism is a story of struggle and resistance. Tell it to your friends. The more you tell it, the better you remember it. Use songs, listen to African music, Afrobeat, highlife, and try to understand the lyrics. Many speak of unity and African pride. Read books, ask your parents to read you African tales or stories of the Mali Empire. Ask questions. If you don't understand a word, like slave trade or colony, ask your teacher or look it up in a dictionary. The important thing is to stay curious, to go further, readings, references, and open questions. If you want to know more about Pan-Africanism and the African economy, here are some leads. B.
A Rich Continent, documentary for children. Films, Kirikou and the Sorceress, an animated film showing life in West Africa. Mali Blues, documentary on Malian music. Websites, the African Union website, O.in has a youth section. The BBC website has articles on African history. Open questions to think about. Why is Africa often presented as a poor continent, when it is rich in resources? How could African unity help solve problems of poverty and conflict? What can you do to support African products, e.g., buy fair trade chocolate, African coffee? Why is it important to know the history of Africa before colonization? How can African children and children of African descent around the world be proud of their heritage? If you were president of the African Union, what would you do to improve the continent's economy? These questions will help you think and become an agent of change.